Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you this morning.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, very good. Today, I want to talk a little bit about crime in the inner cities. I think most people know about it and they hear about it, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions. We spend a lot of time on this program talking about crime, but usually we're dealing with the criminals in Washington, D.C., and there are a fair number of those. You know, when you think of the abuse of our liberties and our privacy, stealing the money from us, and all these things going on. But we're not going to deal with that. We want to talk because, you know, in a way, some people thought that Obama, in his farewell speech, would touch on this. You know, last night in his farewell speech, when Chicago's the worst city, but there were some comments that showed a lot of disappointment. He really didn't deal with the issue. But over the years, there have been two individuals that I've known that have dealt with this crime in the inner city and dealing with the issue of black crime versus white crime, white officers killing black people and this sort of thing. But the two that have sorted this out the very most, and the article that we came across this morning was Walter Williams' article. And Walter I've known for a lot of years. He's, as a matter of fact, been on this program. And he's a professor at George Mason University and teaches sound economic policy. But there's also Tom Sowell.
Yeah, who's now just retired, actually, from writing a column for 30-some years. He retired at 86 from his column. It's pretty amazing. But, you know, yeah, Walter Williams wrote in Lou Rockwell featured him today, and it was really an excellent article because rather than all the rhetoric, he brought out some facts about crime in the inner cities, about murder.
Right, and this to me was very interesting because, you know, we hear the rhetoric, and I know to be suspicious of it. Sometimes it's fake news, and I would think in this issue there tends to be a fake impression. You know, there's a distortion, and I think it's done deliberately. But he pointed out that there are 15,600 type of homicides, killings, you know, in 2015, and 52% of those individuals were blacks that were killed, which percentage-wise, it's very high. But what they didn't point out, which Walter did, was this fact that 90% of those individuals killed were killed by other blacks. So it's and if you talk about that, if you talk about black on black crime, it's almost like you're politically incorrect and you're not allowed to say that, and you're just poking at it because you're a racist, and you're not, like Obama wanted us to remind us, there was a civil war and there was slavery one day, and we can't forget it.
Yeah.
You know, well, maybe someday we should have a statute of limitations on that demagoguery.
Well, certainly it's appropriate that Obama was in Chicago talking about this because, as you point out, it's the worst city for homicides. If anything, it's getting worse. And the idea that you don't care about black lives if you point out some of these facts, if you don't take a look at the problem, how on earth are you ever going to solve it?
And what about the police? Do the white police kill a lot more black people? It turns out that isn't the case. There are twice as many whites who get killed by the police than blacks. Yeah. But you can't say that. And you have to concede that percentage-wise and proportionally that is the case, but there may be a reason for that. But it's black officers that mostly kill, you know, black citizens, a lot more so than white people. But boy, something happens, and if a policeman make a mistake, which they do, and some of them are outrageous, and I don't give them a free pass, but you know, they're taking a gnat in this way and just blowing it way out of proportion and saying, this is the whole thing, and that is why, you know, minorities are victims, and they're being treated like slaves, and they don't get enough free stuff, and they just go on. They have an agenda, and it's to promote big spending, big government, big liberalism.
Yeah, and then you have that exacerbated by certain well-heeled individuals with a very big bank account, you know, and a big agenda. And I'm talking specifically about George Soros, who has an agenda, who is an oligarch with a very globalist, elitist worldview. And he, for example, as we learned from DC Leaks, which was very helpful, he gave $650,000 to the Black Lives Matter group in 2015. So he is financing a lot of these. And one of the things that came out in the WikiLeaks after the shooting of Freddie Gray in Baltimore was a tragic shooting. But he was very excited. His organization was excited. This is going to give us some leverage to push our agenda for police reform. But what do they want for police reform? They want nationalization of the police forces. That's what they want. They want, more centralization of government.
And more militarization, tanks and all of this. Walter, in his article, which he's done this for many, many years to try to point out that the situation back in the 30s and 40s and even early 50s, blacks were, statistically better off. Yes, there was still some poverty, but poverty didn't automatically turn in, to the violence that happens today. There weren't that many agitators coming along. And that, I think, is a big thing. Somebody made a statement that maybe Al Sharpton is going to lose his clout now that Obama is not president. But, the Al Sharptons show up and the Jesse Jackson show up and they distort these views and the media bows over. And unfortunately, the libertarian conservative audience, we sort of get in a bind because they'll distort what you say, and we are easily intimidated. And as everybody knows, I am not a big champion of the president-elect, and I try to be balanced on that. But boy, what I like is he doesn't take the guff from the media. And I think that's worthwhile. At least stop and think about that. Don't run roughshod over people. And I think that's a benefit.
And I think on the same point, a lot of the left libertarians, for fear of being considered politically incorrect, don't want to look at some of the statistical issues and not necessarily value judgments. Bob Wenzel had a great piece on Target Liberty this morning where he quotes Tyler Cowen, who I would consider a left libertarian, socially very liberal. And, he's sort of taking the whole progressive left-wing line on Black Lives Matter. Oh, it's just an organization to protect blacks from the police. And that's, as we see from the WikiLeaks, and it's not that. It has a very different agenda. A lot of it is a cultural Marxist agenda. A lot of it is an economic Marxist agenda. So, and you've expressed concern time and time again over police violence and black victims of police violence, but you actually talk about some of the causes of it.
Yes, and I think that if you say that it's all Black Lives Matters, it's all victimization, it's all just unfair treatment of blacks, then we end up with a mess. Because I think, even though I think it's on a smaller scale, I think the police have overreacted, and they've killed some people they shouldn't have killed, and they're not armed individual, but they're scared to death and they overreact. But that's probably a small amount compared, to the other side that demands it. But Walter, said back in these 40s and 50s, he says before they really pumped up the minimum wage so that minorities and marginal workers would get a certain salary. He says it was the most destructive thing you could do to a new worker who maybe for family reasons and where they live, they didn't get to school and didn't do well. But if they had an incentive to go out and work, then they were handicapped because the wages were set higher than it had to be. So this is a big thing. But we create conditions, economic conditions. And the big picture, of course, is you have the business cycle. When the business cycle goes down, which is going down steadily as far as I'm concerned right now since the beginning of this century, it hurts some people more than others. And because everybody's a victim and everybody demands it, they're entitled to this, and they have a right to this, and then they're still not satisfied, then what happens? Oh, the people who are successful and really drive the fancy cars in the inner city, what are they doing? They're selling drugs. And of course, the drug war, we've complained about the drug war. It creates these conditions. And then I think there is indeed some discrimination in how these drug laws are enforced. If you're poor and black and get caught with some drugs, the odds are you're going to be in big trouble. But there are some other cases where if you happen to be middle class or a modest income white person and can afford a lawyer, it's not so severe. So that just seems to pile up and pile up. But there certainly is a difference in the atmosphere of the 40s and the 50s, why there's more crime. And Walter does touch on something that I've touched on, where the real really, the frustration level goes very high because I think about the warning by our founders that, freedom really doesn't work if you live in an immoral society.
Yeah.
And he recognizes that it's the family. It used to be the black family was breaking up, they were single parent, but it's the white family now too. And number-wise, there's more whites in this category than blacks. But the government, I think the government policy sometimes does harm to a family, but ultimately, it's not going to be the government that solves the family. I don't think it's going to be the government that provides safety for the inner city. Where are the strongest anti-gun laws and the anti-drug laws to protect the poor people in the inner city? That's where the crime is. Maybe if they were had an incentive to defend themselves, if you're capable now, there's pretty strong respect for the Second Amendment. It's always being challenged, but people who can afford to protect themselves, and you can never have a policeman protecting every house, so you have to have self-defense, people willing to do it. But it's still back to this culture. Why is it that where did the family go? Many reasons for that. And what's the substitute? It's interesting that Walter, as I recall, was raised by a single mother in a very poor area of Philadelphia. I mean, he survived it. I think he told me once that his mother was an influence on it. So sometimes you still need it. But I've still heard of cases where the individual survived because of some influence, maybe in sports, maybe a coach, maybe a teacher, but it doesn't change the whole culture.
I think the same is true with Walter Williams, isn't it? That he grew up in New York as a very poor person. So these aren't...
you mean Soul?
I was thinking of Williams, I think.
Walter grew up in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
And
Soul was... That's right.
Yeah. Okay, that... but no, I think that's the same thing. And they sort of survived it all.
So they're not talking from a ivory tower.
No. See, we're totally discredited. We're not going to get on MSNBC tonight and say, "Boy, it's interesting stuff you guys talked about today." Maybe you do have an understanding of what's going on with the drug laws and minimum wage laws and why people are poor and why debasement of the currency wipes out the middle class, hurts the poor more than the rich. Maybe they do that. No, that's not going to happen. They're going to say, they'll say use some bad words for us. But
what's remarkable about what Williams writes? He writes about the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and how things were so much better in the inner city. Well, this is the height of the Jim Crow era. This is where there was a lot more racism, I would say, than there is today. So how do the other side justify their position now that we've gotten rid of Jim Crow, we've gotten rid of racism, that things are actually worse?
Think how many well-intentioned persons, sincere people, moderates that came in and strongly supported Obama. Both times, probably, especially in 2008, because he was talking about change and fairness. And it was almost like, we're putting this stuff behind us. No more of this. We are a people who are open-minded enough to elect a black president. But it didn't get any better.
No.
It got worse, and if anything, it got much worse. And so often it is government, all the way back to slavery and Jim Crow laws and segregation in the military. All these things were government-oriented. Yeah. And I've told a story before, and I'm going to recite a little bit of that. When there was a lot less government under much worse conditions for black, was the story I told about this very special citizen of this particular county, and that's Charlie Brown. Yeah. He'd been a slave most of his life, nearly 40 years. He was born when John Quincy Adams was president, lived to be 92, and died when Warren Harding was president. So he lived a long span of time, but he couldn't read or write. And just not too far from here, he went to work. And he ended up owning 3,000 acres of land. He owned more land than anybody else in the county. He was the richest person in the county. He was the richest black in the whole state of Texas. And he had all kinds of businesses, all kinds of employees that were multiracial. His customers were basically white. And all he got was the return, was rightfully his liberty. Yeah. It was held from him. It was naturally his. He didn't have it. And the release of that burden was so great, and he did not belabor it. He had no affirmative action programs, nothing. But guess what he didn't have? No overburden of government regulators coming in. He didn't have the IRS and the regulation and Fish and Wildlife people and just over and over again. All he had were his neighbors, and he became very wealthy and a great philanthropist. And under those circumstances, it's fantastic. So maybe from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, now we try to help minorities. People are having tough trouble. But it's almost impossible to start a business. You know, small businesses have a tough time. It's over-regulations and taxations, and nobody can even figure it out. So I think the conditions the government creates has a lot to do with this, too. And so, yes, it's the family and this sort of thing, but ultimately, people may well respond if they're given their freedoms and let the government get out of their way and let the individual know nobody's going to come here and give me a handout. And all of a sudden you have somebody works hard and be creative and becomes very productive and donates to his community, church property, school property. There's a school named here in West Columbia after Brown.
Yeah.
So I think that's the story we should concentrate on.
So it sounds like the real problem with inner city violence is the state itself.
Yeah, I'm convinced the problem of the inner cities is very, very serious. We can't solve all the problems because I do believe it's related to the family, but I do believe the government makes it much worse. And my conclusion when I write about this is the best answer to the problems we're facing in the inner city, if we really care, is a libertarian answer. Return liberty to the people, get the government out of the way, and make sure everybody knows what libertarian means. And that means you can't hurt people, you can't steal from people, and you can't kill people, and you have to respect people's rights and property. Under those circumstances, guess what? There's prosperity and less wars. How can we beat that? I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.